The rain came in sheets that February morning, drumming against the wooden hull of the fishing boat as it cut through the gray waters off Hidachi province. The fishermen had seen many strange things pulled from the sea over the years, but nothing had prepared them for what they were about to encounter on the 22nd day of February, 1803. At first, it appeared as little more than a shadow on the horizon, bobbing unnaturally in the swells. As they drew closer, the men fell silent. What they had mistaken for debris was something altogether different. A vessel, yes, but unlike anything in their experience. It was hollow and round, they would later report, constructed of some pale metal that caught the weak morning light. Rosewood and iron bands reinforced its structure, but it was the windows that stopped them cold. Crystal or glass, impossibly clear, set into the craft's side like unblinking eyes staring back at them. The fishermen circled the object, their voices hushed, their hands gripping the rails of their boat. Strange characters covered the hull, a script none of them recognized. Not Chinese. Not Dutch. Not any language spoken in the ports they knew. The symbols seemed to shimmer in the rain, indecipherable and alien. They made the decision to tow it back to shore. Word spread quickly through the village, and by the time they beached the craft, a crowd had gathered. Someone found the mechanism to open it. The seal broke with a sound like an exhaled breath, and inside they found her. She was beautiful, the witnesses would insist for the rest of their lives. Young, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, with pale skin and features that marked her as foreign, though from where, no one could say. Her clothing was fine, made of fabrics they did not recognize. But it was what she held that captured their attention most. A wooden box, roughly 2 feet long, clutched against her chest with both arms. Her fingers were white with the pressure of her grip. She spoke to them, her voice clear, but her words meaningless. They tried Japanese, then the fragments of Chinese and Portuguese they knew from traders. Nothing. She responded in her own tongue, fluid and urgent. But it was like listening to water flow over stones. The sounds were familiar as human speech, yet contained no meaning they could extract. Her eyes moved from face to face, searching for understanding that never came. The box remained locked in her embrace. When one of the village elders reached for it gently, she pulled back, fear flashing across her face. Whatever was inside, she would not be separated from it. Some say she wept. Others claim she remained composed, dignified even, as the crowd pressed closer to examine this impossible visitor. Here, 220 years later, we must pause and ask ourselves what we are truly looking at. This account, documented in multiple sources from the period, reads like something torn from modern UFO reports. An unusual craft marked with undecipherable symbols. A being from an unknown origin. An encounter that defies conventional explanation. The parallels are unsettling. Where had this woman come from? The ocean stretched vast in all directions, and no ship had been reported in distress. What was in the box she guarded so desperately? And why, after all their examination and their questions that produced no answers, did the fishermen make the choice they did? They pushed her back out to sea, back into her strange vessel, still clutching her mysterious box, still speaking her unknown language. They sealed the craft and set it adrift on the outgoing tide, watching as it grew smaller against the gray water until it vanished completely. She was never seen again. No wreckage was ever found. No explanation ever emerged. Just a woman and her secrets, swallowed by the Pacific, leaving behind only questions that echo across 2 centuries into our present moment. In the spring of 1813, a strange vessel appeared off the coast of Hitachi province in Japan. And what makes this story, unlike countless other tales of mysterious encounters, is not what was seen, but rather who documented it, and how they chose to record what happened. 3 separate texts from the early 1800s preserve accounts of this event, and each was written by educated men of the Edo period, chroniclers and scholars, who dedicated their lives to recording the factual happenings of their time. These were not storytellers spinning ghost tales by firelight. These were not peasants sharing folklore. These were literate officials and respected historians whose job was to document reality as they understood it. The first account appears in a text called Ton Shosetsu, compiled by a samurai and scholar named Kyokute Bacon, a man whose literary reputation would endure for centuries. Bacon was methodical. almost obsessive in his attention to detail when recording events. His documentation of the strange vessel reads like a bureaucratic report, dry and systematic. He notes the date, the location along the coast, the weather conditions. He describes how local fishermen first spotted the craft drifting in shallow waters, how it appeared round or perhaps octagonal in shape, how it measured roughly 3.5 meters in height and between 5 and 7 meters in diameter. These are not the flourishes of fiction. These are measurements, specifications, the language of someone attempting to record observable facts. The vessel itself, according to Bacon's account, possessed characteristics that defied easy explanation. The upper portion appeared to be constructed of what witnesses described as rosewood or a similar dark polished wood, fitted with several windows made of glass or crystal, an expensive and unusual material for any watercraft of that era. The lower portion was described as reinforced with iron bands, or perhaps constructed entirely of metal, clad in plates that protected it from the sea. Inside, when the fishermen peered through the windows, they observed a woman unlike any they had encountered. She had pale skin, reddish hair, and wore strange clothing that seemed foreign to any nation they knew. She held a box, rectangular and plain, which she would not release. She spoke in a language no one could understand. The fishermen debated what to do with her, and eventually, according to Bacon's account, they set the vessel adrift again, sending both the woman and her inexplicable craft back to the ocean. Now here is where the documentation becomes deeply unsettling. This was not an isolated account. A second text, Hayari Kish, which translates roughly to an anthology of tales of castaways and maritime incidents, also records this same event. The compiler of this text was an entirely different scholar working independently, yet the core details align with disturbing precision. The location matches. The time frame matches. The description of the woman matches. But the vessel itself, in this second telling, takes on slightly different characteristics. Here, it is described as pale, almost white, with a surface that appeared smooth and metallic rather than wooden. The windows are mentioned again. The strange woman with the box appears again, but the material construction has shifted in the description. Was this simply a matter of different witnesses interpreting what they saw through different frameworks of understanding? Or were these separate incidents being conflated? Or something stranger still? The third account appears in a text called Yume no Kiri, another compilation of various incidents and observations from the period. Once again, an independent author. Once again, a similar story, and once again those subtle but significant variations in detail. The chronicler here emphasizes the metallic quality of the craft, describing it as pale like the moon, smooth like polished stone, yet strong like iron. The woman appears again with her mysterious box. The fishermen appear again with their confusion and eventual decision to send her away. 3 texts, 3 separate authors, 3 versions of what should be the same event, if indeed it was a real event at all. What creates the deep unease when reading these historical documents is not the strangeness of the story itself. History is full of strange stories. Mystery vessels, unusual encounters, unexplained phenomena. These populate the margins of countless cultural records. What disturbs is the tone, the presentation, the bureaucratic matter-of-factness with which these educated men recorded something that seems impossible. They were not writing ghost stories for entertainment. The Edo period had its share of supernatural tales, demon legends, ghost stories that were clearly marked as folklore, as entertainment, as moral instruction wrapped in fiction. Those texts had a different voice, a different structure. They employed literary devices, poetic language, moral frameworks that signaled to readers that they were entering the realm of story. These accounts of the vessel and the woman have none of that. They read like incident reports. They include the kind of mundane details that writers include when they are trying to faithfully record something they believe happened. The weather that day, the specific stretch of coastline, the names of villages, the occupations of witnesses. When Kyokude Bacon noted that the vessel measured roughly 3.5 meters in height, he was doing what any dutiful chronicler would do when faced with something unusual. He was trying to quantify it, to pin it down with measurements and observations that future readers could evaluate. So we are left with troubling questions. If this was pure fabrication, what motivated 3 separate scholars to invent or perpetuate the same false story? The Edo period was not lacking in actual events to document. It was a time of political complexity, social change, natural disasters, and genuine maritime incidents. Chroniclers had no shortage of real material. Why waste ink and effort on a coordinated fiction? And if it was not coordinated, if three men independently invented similar tales, what explains the consistency? The pale-haired woman, the mysterious box she would not release, the strange craft unlike any boat in common use, the decision by fishermen to send her back rather than report her to authorities. Consider the possibility that they were recording something that genuinely happened, something they genuinely believed happened based on witness testimony they considered reliable. In that case, what were they actually documenting? A foreign vessel from a nation unknown to them? The early 1800s saw increasing pressure from foreign powers on Japan's isolated shores. Russian ships appeared in northern waters. European vessels tested the boundaries of Japan's seclusion policy. Could this have been a lifeboat from a wrecked foreign ship? Its materials and construction so unfamiliar to local fishermen that they described it in terms that made it sound otherworldly? The woman could have been European, her pale skin and light hair utterly foreign to people who had lived their entire lives in a sealed nation. Her language would have been incomprehensible. Her clothing would have seemed strange. The box she clutched could have contained anything, items precious to her, documents, personal belongings she refused to abandon even in crisis. But this explanation, rational as it seems, struggles against certain details. Why would multiple accounts describe the craft as round or octagonal? Lifeboats were not constructed this way. Why would the lower half be reinforced with metal to such a degree that multiple witnesses remarked upon it? Why would there be windows of glass or crystal? These were not features of emergency watercraft. And most puzzling of all, why would fishermen, who would have been accustomed to occasional encounters with foreign vessels by the early 1800s, find this so remarkable that it demanded documentation by multiple independent scholars? The variations between accounts create their own layer of mystery. When three people describe the same event with mostly matching details but crucial differences, it suggests something more complex than simple fabrication. Fabricated stories, especially those meant to deceive, tend toward either exact repetition or wildly divergent details. These accounts sit in an uncomfortable middle ground. The ship is rosewood and iron in one telling, pale and metallic in another. These are not minor variations in adjectives. These are fundamentally different material descriptions. Yet the woman remains consistent. The box remains consistent. The location and the response of the fishermen remain consistent. This pattern suggests witnesses interpreting something genuinely strange through the limited framework of their existing knowledge. Imagine trying to describe materials or construction techniques you had never encountered, had no words for, no context to understand. You would reach for approximations. To one observer, a surface might appear wooden because wood was the familiar material for boats. To another, the same surface might appear metallic because its smoothness and strength suggested metal. Both could be describing the same object filtered through different perceptual frameworks and different vocabularies. What haunts the modern reader examining these texts is the sincerity embedded in the documentation. These chroniclers believed they were recording something real. You can feel it in the structure of their writing, in the inclusion of verifiable details like place names and dates, in the absence of moral lessons or supernatural embellishments that would signal fictional intent. They wrote as witnesses to the strange, attempting to preserve an accurate account for future generations to puzzle over. And puzzle we do, centuries later, holding these documents and asking questions that may have no satisfying answers. Were they deceived by witnesses who lied? Possible, but why would fishermen invent such a story? What would they gain? Were they recording genuine encounters with foreign vessels so unusual that they seemed to defy explanation? Perhaps, though the details resist easy categorization into known maritime technology of any nation in that era, were they perpetuating a myth that had already taken hold, each chronicler adding their documentation to a growing legend they believed to be fact? This seems most likely, yet it simply moves the mystery one step back. Where did the original story come from? Who was the first to tell it? And why did it take the shape it did? The bureaucratic tone of these documents refuses to let us dismiss them comfortably. If they were folklore, they would sound like folklore. If they were deliberate fiction, they would contain the markers of fiction. Instead, they sound like confused men trying to document something that exceeded their ability to explain, something that existed in the gap between the known and the unknown, recorded with all the tools of serious historical scholarship because nothing else seemed appropriate. The drawings themselves are what haunt you first. Not what they depict, but the way they depict it. When you examine the historical records of the Utsuro-bune, spread across multiple documents from the early 1800s, you notice something immediately unsettling. The precision. The consistency. These aren't the rough sketches of confused fishermen trying to recall a strange dream. These are technical diagrams, rendered with careful attention to measurement and proportion, as if the witnesses understood they were documenting something that shouldn't exist. The vessel was circular, not boat-shaped, not following any maritime design principle known to Japanese or Western shipbuilding of the era. Imagine trying to describe this to someone who had never seen it. The chronicler settled on comparisons to everyday objects. A rice cooking pot, some said. An incense burner, others suggested. But these comparisons fall short when you examine the dimensions they recorded so carefully. Approximately 3.3 meters in height, 5.4 meters in width. These aren't vague estimations. These are measurements someone took seriously, as if they knew future generations would demand proof. The shape itself defies logic. Maritime vessels in 1803 followed centuries of refined design principles. Boats needed to cut through water. They required keels for stability, pointed bows to reduce resistance, flat bottoms or curved hulls depending on their purpose. The Utsuro-bune ignored all of this. It was described as having a bowl-like lower section, rounded and enclosed, meeting an upper section that rose in a gentle curve. Some illustrations show it as nearly spherical, with the top and bottom slightly flattened. Others depict it more like two bowls pressed together, edge to edge, forming a lens shape. But it's the details that transform these drawings from curious to deeply disturbing. The vessel was constructed in two distinct sections, and this division wasn't decorative. It was fundamental to its design. The upper half featured windows. Multiple sources confirm this, but not simple openings covered with oiled paper or wooden shutters, which is what you'd expect from Japanese craftsmanship of that era. These were described as crystal, as glass, as some kind of transparent material that allowed clear viewing both in and out. Think about what that means. In 1803, glass manufacturing in Japan was extremely limited. Window glass, as we understand it, was essentially non-existent in common use. The Dutch trading post at Dejima might have had glass windows, imported at enormous expense from Europe. But here, in this vessel that appeared on a rural beach, witnesses described multiple windows made of a transparent material, so clear and well-fitted that they formed a watertight seal. The documents don't describe these windows as particularly remarkable in their clarity, which suggests they were of a quality that seemed natural to their construction, perhaps even superior to what the witnesses knew. The lower half presents an even stranger picture. The bottom section of the vessel was reinforced with iron plates. The illustrations show these plates fitted together with precision, forming a protective shell around the lower hemisphere. Iron plating. On a small craft, in 1803, Japanese metalworking was sophisticated, certainly, but iron was precious. It was used for weapons, for tools, for agricultural implements. The idea of using iron plates to sheath the bottom of a small vessel speaks to either immense resources or a fundamental misunderstanding of how boats were supposed to be built. Or, more disturbingly, a completely different set of engineering priorities. The iron wasn't decorative. The descriptions make this clear. It was structural, protective. Some accounts mention that the metal had a reddish tinge, possibly copper, mixed with iron, or perhaps oxidation. The plates were fitted together with what appeared to be great skill, sealed at the joints. This detail appears again and again. The vessel didn't leak. It had survived ocean travel, potentially long-distance ocean travel, without taking on water. With a design that should have been catastrophically unstable, it remained seaworthy enough to wash ashore intact. Now consider the windows again, but from an engineering perspective. To create a watertight seal with transparent material requires precision in manufacturing both the window and its frame. The tolerances have to be exact. In wooden shipbuilding of the era, gaps were sealed with tar, with oakum, with pitch. These materials were opaque. They were flexible enough to accommodate the wood's natural expansion and contraction. But transparent materials, glass or crystal, are rigid. They crack under stress. They require perfect frames, compression seals, some method of absorbing the shock and flex of ocean travel without shattering or letting water seep through. The witnesses drew these windows in their correct positions, consistently across multiple accounts. Some illustrations show 4 windows in the upper section, arranged symmetrically. Others depict 6, but they all show the same basic configuration: transparent panels set into the upper half of the craft, allowing natural light into the interior. This wasn't a submarine, meant to travel underwater. The windows suggest a vessel designed to let occupants see out, to let light in. But the sealed, reinforced construction suggests a craft meant to survive conditions far more severe than coastal fishing boats ever encountered. Inside, the accounts become even more disturbing. Those who peered through the transparent windows, or who were allowed brief glimpses into the interior when the upper section was opened, described a space that made no sense. The interior walls were covered in symbols, not a few decorative characters, but extensive writing or notation covering available surfaces. And here's what makes your skin prickle. These symbols match no known writing system. Not Japanese kanji atai. Not the Chinese characters from which kanji derived. Not Korean hangul. Not any form of script the witnesses had encountered from Dutch traders or Chinese merchants. Not Sanskrit from Buddhist texts. Nothing. Nothing. The chroniclers of 1803 weren't isolated villagers who'd never seen foreign writing. Japan, despite its official isolation, had contact with Chinese culture spanning centuries. Educated Japanese could read Chinese texts. They'd seen examples of European alphabets through Dutch trade. Buddhist monks could recognize Sanskrit, Tibetan script, various forms of religious notation from across Asia. But these symbols defied classification. The accounts described them with a sense of frustrated confusion. They were clearly intentional, organized into what appeared to be lines or sequences, but they conveyed no meaning to anyone who saw them. Some descriptions mention that the characters appeared to be painted or inscribed directly onto the interior surface. Others suggest they might have been inlaid or formed by some other method. What's consistent is that they were permanent, integrated into the vessel's construction, not added as an afterthought. This was a craft covered inside with extensive notation in an unknown language. Why? For navigation? For operation? Were they instructions, warnings, record? The precision of these details across multiple sources is what strips away easy dismissal. If this were a folklore tale that evolved over time, you'd expect variation. Details would shift, grow more fantastical, become embellished. But the Utsuro-bune accounts maintain remarkable consistency in their technical descriptions. The size remains the same. The 2-part construction, upper and lower halves, the transparent windows, the iron reinforcement, the unknown writing. These elements appear again and again, drawn and redrawn with the careful attention of people trying desperately to document physical reality. Compare this to how mythology typically develops. Legendary objects become grander with each retelling. Dragons grow larger. Swords become more magical. Mysterious ships would be expected to gain additional rooms, strange powers, impossible features. But the Utsuro-bune stays stubbornly concrete, 3.3 meters high, 5.4 meters wide. Specific numbers that don't change. As if the witnesses knew these details mattered, that precision was crucial for future understanding. The technological impossibilities compound when you consider the complete picture. This was a sealed craft with windows, implying internal air that needed to remain breathable. The woman inside had survived a journey of unknown duration. The vessel remained watertight, despite its bizarre construction. It was stable enough to navigate ocean currents without capsizing, despite a shape that violated every principle of maritime stability. It beached itself gently enough that the woman inside was unharmed, and the craft itself showed no signs of severe damage. How do you build such a thing with early 19th century technology? You don't. You can't. The materials science alone presents insurmountable problems. Creating transparent panels that won't shatter or leak, forming iron plates to exact specifications and sealing them watertight, designing a rounded hull that remains stable in open water, solving the dozens of engineering challenges that this design presents. Each one individually would be difficult. Together, they describe something that shouldn't exist. And yet, the drawings persist. Multiple independent sources, created by different hands, depicting the same impossible craft. The illustrations have a quality of bewildered accuracy, as if the artists were working from direct observation, trying to capture something their minds struggled to process. The line work shows careful measurement. The proportions remain consistent. The technical details align across separate accounts. These aren't imaginative sketches. They're documentary evidence, created by witnesses who understood that no one would believe them, so precision was their only defense against dismissal. The eerie calm of these illustrations is perhaps most disturbing of all. No dramatic waves, no supernatural effects, no signs of otherworldly power. Just a strange vessel, rendered with almost clinical detachment, sitting on a beach where it had no right to be. The drawings say, this happened. This was real. This is what we saw. And no matter how impossible it seems, we drew it exactly as it was, because someone needed to know. The morning sun had barely climbed above the horizon when the fishermen first saw it, drifting with the tide like a ghost made manifest. The small wooden boat, strange and foreign in its construction, bobbed gently in the waves off the coast, and inside it sat a woman who would become one of the most enduring mysteries in Japanese maritime history. This was not their imagination playing tricks in the early light. This was real, tangible, and utterly inexplicable. The fishermen approached cautiously, their own boats cutting through the calm water. What they found defied everything they knew about the world beyond their shores. The woman inside the vessel was unlike anyone they had ever encountered, and her appearance would be documented with such careful detail that we can still reconstruct her image more than 2 centuries later. Her skin was pale, witnesses recorded, but not the familiar paleness of their own people. It possessed a quality they struggled to describe, a different tone entirely that marked her as fundamentally foreign. Her clothing arrested their attention immediately. She wore garments of red and white, colors that held deep significance in Japanese culture, yet the style of her dress bore no resemblance to any fashion they recognized. It was not Chinese, not Korean, not from any of the trading nations they knew. The cut, the fabric, the very way it draped across her body spoke of somewhere distant and unknown. But it was her hair that truly unsettled them. She had red eyebrows, an oddity that several accounts made certain to emphasize. In a culture where dark hair was universal, this detail stood out like a beacon of otherness. More disturbing still were extensions woven into her hair, created from materials no one could identify. These were not the hairpieces familiar to Japanese women of status. The texture was wrong, the construction alien. The very concept of how they attached remained a mystery to those who witnessed them. The woman sat in her strange vessel with an eerie composure. She did not weep, did not cry out for help, did not display the panic one might expect from someone cast adrift at sea. Instead, she maintained a calm that bordered on the supernatural. Her eyes, witnesses would later recall, held a distant quality, as though she existed somewhere beyond the immediate reality surrounding her. She was present yet unreachable, visible yet incomprehensible. Clutched in her arms was a wooden box, approximately 60 centimeters in length. The measurements were recorded with precision because this box would become central to the entire mystery. It was clearly crafted with care, its surfaces smooth and finished, suggesting it contained something of tremendous value. The woman held it against her chest with an intensity that communicated everything words could not. This box was not merely cargo. It was not simple baggage or a convenient container. The way she gripped it, the way her fingers pressed into its wooden surface, the way she angled her body to shield it from view. All of this told the fisherman that whatever lay inside mattered more to her own survival. They gestured for her to come aboard their larger vessel, using the universal language of outstretched hands and welcoming expressions. She seemed to understand this much, and allowed them to help her transfer from the drifting boat to their own. But the box, that mysterious wooden box, she would not release. When curious hands reached toward it, her calm demeanor cracked just enough to show steel beneath. She pulled it closer, turned away, made it clear through every line of her body that this object would not be examined, would not be touched, would not be opened. The fisherman tried to communicate, embarking on an exercise in frustration that would continue for the duration of her time in their custody. They spoke slowly, as if volume and careful pronunciation might somehow bridge the chasm of incomprehension between them. She responded in a language that sounded like nothing in their experience. It was not Chinese, which some among them knew. It was not any dialect from the peninsula or the islands. The phonemes themselves felt foreign, the rhythm of her speech following patterns that belonged to no linguistic tradition they recognized. They tried gestures, pointing to objects and speaking their names, hoping she might repeat or offer her own words in exchange. She watched these attempts with that same distant calm, occasionally responding in her unknown tongue. But no connection formed. They pointed to the sea, to the sky, to food and water, to themselves. She observed, sometimes seeming to understand the intent, while remaining unable or unwilling to bridge the gap. The barrier between them was absolute, a wall more impenetrable than any physical obstacle. As word spread of the mysterious woman, locals gathered to witness this living enigma. They brought scholars, those who knew multiple languages, who had traveled or studied texts from distant lands. Each attempted communication, certain that their knowledge would unlock the mystery. Each failed. Her language remained opaque, resistant to all attempts at translation or recognition. It was as though she spoke in sounds that human mouths should not be able to produce. Or perhaps it was simply so removed from any known linguistic family that no point of reference existed. Throughout all of this, she never released her grip on the box. Days passed, and still she held it. She slept with it pressed against her body. She ate with one hand while the other maintained contact with its wooden surface. The fishermen grew increasingly curious, their speculation building into obsession. What could possibly inspire such devotion? What treasure or artifact could be important enough that a woman cast adrift at sea would guard it with more fervor than she guarded her own life? Some accounts from that period, preserved in local records and personal journals, suggest that witnesses believed she would rather die than allow the box to be opened by others. This was not mere attachment. This was a bond that transcended normal human relationships with objects. One observer noted that she seemed to draw strength from its presence, as though whatever lay inside provided her with some essential sustenance that food and water could not match. Theories emerged immediately, as they always do when faced with the inexplicable. Perhaps she was a foreign princess, sent away from her homeland for reasons political or personal. Quality. The box might contain royal regalia, proof of her identity, documents that would be meaningless to Japanese fishermen, but invaluable in her native land. This theory had romantic appeal, the notion of nobility in exile, but it failed to explain the complete absence of any identifying markers, any attendants, any of the trappings one would expect even for a disgraced royal. Others proposed she was a castaway from a shipwreck, the sole survivor of some maritime disaster. The foreign vessels supported this idea. Perhaps a trading ship from unknown waters had foundered in a storm, and she alone had managed to escape in this small craft. The box might contain the ship's valuables, entrusted to her in those final desperate moments. But this explanation struggled against the peculiarity of her circumstances. Why only her? Why no debris, no other survivors, no trace of a larger vessel? The exile theory gained traction among those of a more cynical disposition. She had committed some crime, they suggested, or offended someone powerful, and had been set adrift as punishment. The box contained evidence of her transgression, or perhaps the very thing she had stolen, and she clung to it out of guilt or defiance. This painted her as tragic rather than noble, a victim of her own choices, condemned to wander the seas as penance. But there were those who whispered of something far stranger. They noted the otherworldly quality of her composure, The unusual materials in her hair extensions, the way she seemed not quite of this world. What if she was not fully human? They murmured. Or what if she came from somewhere that existed outside normal geography? The box, in this telling, might contain something supernatural, an object of power or spiritual significance that could not be revealed to mortal eyes. These whispers were dismissed by the rational-minded, yet they persisted, finding fertile ground in the imagination of a culture rich with tales of spirits and supernatural visitors. Her behavior reinforced the mystery rather than resolving it. She accepted food, but showed no gratitude or relief. She observed her surroundings with interest, but no apparent distress at her situation. She neither sought help to return home, nor seemed resigned to permanent displacement. She simply existed, present in body, while her mind and spirit remained locked away behind barriers of language and intention. The question of the box's contents tormented those who witnessed her. 60 centimeters of smooth wood, carefully crafted, zealously guarded. Some speculated documents or maps. Others imagined jewelry or precious metals. The more imaginative suggested religious artifacts, fragments of bone or holy texts. A few believed it might contain the ashes or remains of someone she loved, making her journey a final pilgrimage. But without communication, without any way to ask or understand her answers, all theories remained equally valid and equally unverifiable. What haunts us about this mystery is not simply the unknown contents of a box, but the presence of a living, breathing human being who remained fundamentally unknowable despite physical proximity. She was there, touchable, visible, real, yet as distant as if she existed on another plane of reality. The language barrier created an isolation more complete than any ocean. She was surrounded by people, and utterly alone, understood by no one and understanding nothing. Her calm acceptance of this isolation disturbs us because it suggests reserves of strength or resignation that most of us cannot fathom. To be so completely cut off from human connection and yet maintain composure speaks to either extraordinary mental fortitude or a disconnection from normal human needs. Which was it? Was she sustained by whatever lay in that box, or had her ordeal broken something essential inside her, leaving only this eerie tranquility in its wake? The fisherman eventually made a decision about her fate, but that is another part of this story. What matters for understanding the human mystery at its core is this period of contact without connection, communication without comprehension. Here was proof that physical presence means nothing without shared language, shared context, shared understanding. Two groups of humans occupied the same space and remained as foreign to each other as different species might be. The mystery of who she was, where she came from, and what she carried in that wooden box has never been solved. She appeared, was documented in meticulous detail, and then vanished back into obscurity, leaving behind only questions that grow more profound with time. Was she a princess, an exile, a castaway, or something stranger still? The answer died with her, locked inside that impenetrable box she would not release. Sealed behind a language no one could understand, hidden within a calm exterior that revealed nothing of the truth beneath. The woman arrived in a hollow ship, and Japan would whisper about it for 2 centuries. But the question that keeps researchers awake at night is not whether the 1803 incident happened. It is whether she was the only one. During the Edo period, in the years when Japan sealed itself away from the world, coastal villages developed a peculiar tradition. Fishermen would gather on winter nights and share stories of strange vessels washing ashore, of impossible visitors who appeared from the fog and vanished just as quickly. These tales were not merely entertainment. They were warnings, carefully disguised as folklore, passed down through generations who understood that some truths could only be spoken in whispers. The Utsuro-bune legend of 1803 is the most famous of these accounts, but it stands among many. Historical records scattered across different prefectures reveal a pattern that modern researchers find deeply unsettling. In 1796, 7 years before the famous incident, fishermen in Hitachi province reported finding a similar round vessel drifting near the shore. This craft, described in a merchant's diary discovered in the 1980s, was said to be made of strange materials, that resembled neither wood nor metal. The fisherman who found it claimed the craft was empty, though fresh water pooled on its floor, and a sweet, unfamiliar scent lingered in the air. In 1825, more than 2 decades after the woman in white arrived, another account emerged from a village in what is now Ibaraki Prefecture. A local magistrate's records describe a sealed container of unusual construction that washed ashore following a violent storm. The villagers, the magistrate wrote, refused to open it. They pushed it back into the sea at high tide, performing purification rituals for days afterward. The magistrate noted their fear with obvious disdain, calling it superstition. But he also recorded that he did not order them to retrieve it. Something about the object troubled him enough to let it go. These scattered accounts raise a chilling possibility. The woman in the hollow ship may have been simply the only arrival that was documented in enough detail to survive. How many other vessels came ashore in the 264 years of Sakaku, when Japan's borders were sealed and contact with foreigners meant death? How many were destroyed immediately, their existence scrubbed from official records to protect those who witnessed them? The isolation period created a unique form of cultural anxiety. From 1639 to 1853, Japan existed in self-imposed quarantine from the outside world. The Tokugawa shogunate had decreed that no foreigner could enter Japan, and no Japanese person could leave. The penalty for violation was execution. Portuguese traders were expelled. Christian converts were hunted down and killed. Even Japanese fishermen, who drifted too far from shore and were rescued by foreign vessels, were forbidden to return home, considered contaminated by outside contact. In this atmosphere of absolute control and paranoid isolation, coastal communities occupied a dangerous position. They were the boundary between the known and the forbidden, the place where the outside world might intrude despite all prohibitions. Every strange object that washed ashore represented a potential catastrophe. Report it to authorities and you might face questioning about why you were in that area, what you might have touched, whether you had communicated with anyone foreign. Fail to report it and you risked execution for concealing contact with the outside world. This impossible position created a culture of selective blindness. Fishermen learned to see only what was safe to see. Village leaders developed elaborate systems of plausible deniability. And some encounters were simply erased, never spoken of except in carefully coded folklore. Buddhist symbolism runs deep through these legends, providing a spiritual framework that made the stories both more acceptable and more terrifying. In Buddhist tradition, the concept of the vessel carries profound meaning. The body itself is a vessel for the soul, temporary and hollow, carrying consciousness across the sea of existence toward enlightenment or rebirth. Ships represent transition between states of being, the journey from one shore to another, from one world to the next. The hollow ship, then, becomes a powerful symbol of liminality. It exists between categories, neither fully of this world nor entirely of another. The woman inside occupies the same impossible space, neither alive nor dead in any conventional sense, neither Japanese nor foreign, in ways that made cultural sense to those who found her. She is a soul in transition, caught between shores. Ancient Japanese texts reference the concept of Tokoyo, the eternal land across the sea. In Shinto tradition, Tokoyo was sometimes conceived as a paradise, sometimes as the realm of the dead, sometimes as a distant foreign land where immortals dwell. Mysterious arrivals from the sea were sometimes interpreted as visitors from Tokoyo, beings who had crossed from that other shore into the mortal world. These arrivals were considered deeply auspicious, but also dangerous, carrying power that ordinary humans were not meant to touch. The Buddhist concept of the 6 realms of existence adds another layer. Souls cycle through different states, from hell to heaven, from hungry ghost to animal to human. The journey between realms might require a vessel, a craft to carry consciousness across the void between one state and another. Could the hollow ships be literal manifestations of this spiritual technology, breakthrough points where the metaphysical becomes physical? Coastal folklore across Japan reveals recurring motifs that suggest these ideas were widespread. Tales of ghost ships crewed by the dead appear in records from multiple regions. Stories of sealed vessels that must not be opened echo across centuries. Legends warn of beautiful women found in impossible circumstances, too perfect to be human, too real to dismiss as spirits. These women often bring misfortune to those who help them or keep them. They are tests, perhaps, or warnings, or something that human language cannot quite capture. The temporal pattern of these accounts deserves attention. Sightings of strange vessels cluster around periods of social upheaval and natural disaster. The late 1700s and early 1800s, when the most detailed Utsuro-bune accounts emerge, were years of famine, earthquake, and increasing pressure on Japan's isolation policy. Foreign ships were being spotted with increasing frequency beyond the territorial waters. Russian expeditions were probing from the north. British and American vessels were beginning to challenge the exclusion. In times of crisis, the boundary between worlds grows thin. This is a belief found across cultures, but in Edo period Japan, it took on specific meanings. The cosmic order and the political order were understood as connected. When the shogunate's control wavered, when natural disasters suggested heaven's displeasure, the barriers between Tokoyo and the mortal realm might weaken. Mysterious arrivals could be interpreted as symptoms of larger disorder, physical proof that things were not as they should be. Some modern researchers propose a more mundane explanation for the pattern. Perhaps what villagers were finding were not supernatural vessels, but evidence of shipwrecks from other nations. European ships, Chinese junks, Korean vessels caught in storms and destroyed, with only strange debris washing ashore. The isolation laws meant that even identifying such objects correctly was dangerous. Better to mythologize them, to transform political danger into spiritual mystery. But this explanation has a glaring flaw. The accounts are too specific, too consistent in their details. The round or octagonal shape appears repeatedly. The glass or crystal panels. The strange writing. The sealed nature of the vessels. Random shipwreck debris would not produce such consistent descriptions across decades and different regions. Another theory suggests that some of these vessels were domestic in origin, secret projects of the shogunate or wealthy merchants, crafts designed for purposes that needed to remain hidden. But again, the evidence does not quite fit. Why would such vessels be set adrift? Why would they contain foreign women and unknown languages? The most unsettling possibility is that something was actually arriving repeatedly, and that the 1803 incident became famous precisely because it was witnessed by enough people that it could not be completely suppressed. The woman survived long enough to be seen, to be drawn, to be recorded in multiple documents. She created evidence that outlasted the immediate political need for silence. If this is true, then the question becomes, what were the other arrivals that were successfully hidden? How many hollow ships were destroyed on the beach, their occupants killed or smuggled away, all evidence burned and buried? How many witnesses took secrets to their graves, knowing that speaking would mean death for themselves and everyone they loved? The folklore suggests that coastal communities developed protocols for these situations, unwritten rules passed down through generations. Some legends speak of specific beaches where strange things were allowed to wash ashore, places where the spirits were strong enough to contain the otherworldly. Other tales mention families with special duties, lineages tasked with dealing with arrivals that could not be acknowledged officially. There are whispers in local histories of the cleaners, individuals who would be summoned when something impossible appeared. These people existed in official records as monks or merchants or fishermen, but their true role was to make problems disappear. A hollow ship on the beach at dawn would be gone by dusk, and everyone involved would develop sudden amnesia about what they might have seen. The silence itself becomes part of the legend. What cannot be spoken of grows more powerful in its absence. The hollow ships haunt Japanese folklore, not despite the gaps in documentation, but because of them. The spaces between recorded incidents pulse with possibility, with all the arrivals that might have happened in the long years when Japan kept the world at bay. Today, researchers continue to find new fragments, new diary entries and local records that hint at the larger pattern. Each discovery raises more questions than it answers. Each hollow ship that emerges from historical obscurity suggests 10 more that remain hidden, their stories lost to the necessary silence of a paranoid age. The woman in the hollow ship should have faded into obscurity, Another curious footnote in Japan's vast collection of folklore and historical oddities. Instead, she was about to become something far stranger, a celebrity of the space age, reborn in the fevered imaginations of a generation looking skyward for answers. It began quietly in the 1960s, when a French author named Jacques Bergier stumbled across the Utsuro-bune account while researching unexplained historical phenomena. Bergier, who co-wrote Morning of the Magicians with Louis Pauwels, noticed something that sent electricity through the nascent astronaut community. The hollow ship's description, when stripped of its cultural context and viewed through the lens of modern technology, bore an unsettling resemblance to reports flooding in from across the globe. Flying saucers. Unidentified flying object. UFOs. Consider the specifics for a moment. The vessel was described as circular, or bowl-shaped, constructed from materials the Japanese witnesses could not identify. It had windows made of crystal or glass, remarkably clear for the early 1800s. The interior featured strange writing that matched no known language system. The woman inside wore unfamiliar clothing and could not communicate despite appearing human. And perhaps most tantalizingly, the craft was described in multiple accounts as having metal bands or reinforcing rings, a detail that mirrors the classic flying saucer silhouette that would emerge in popular culture nearly 150 years later. By the early 1970s, researchers like Eric von Däniken were actively incorporating the Utsuro-bune incident into broader theories about ancient astronaut visitation. The logic went something like this. If extraterrestrial beings had been visiting Earth throughout human history, wouldn't we expect to find accounts of strange craft and otherworldly visitors in historical record? The Utsuro-bune narrative seemed to fit perfectly. Here was a documented case, recorded by multiple sources, describing a vessel that defied the technological capabilities of its time, carrying a woman who appeared human but possessed artifacts and knowledge completely foreign to her discoverer. The UFO connection gained further traction when researchers began cataloging similarities between the Utsuro-bune description and modern UFO reports. Witnesses to alleged UFO encounters frequently described craft with smooth metallic surfaces, clear viewing ports, and occupants who appeared humanoid but somehow different, slightly off in ways difficult to articulate. The woman from the hollow ship, with her pale skin, unusual height, and exotic appearance, could have stepped directly from a 20th century close encounter report. But here is where the rational mind begins its work, systematically attempting to dismantle the extraordinary and replace it with the mundane. Surely, in the vast Pacific Ocean of the early 19th century, there must be a conventional explanation. Surely this was simply a case of cultural misunderstanding, a perfectly normal event distorted through the lens of isolation and unfamiliarity. The first rational theory points westward, toward Russia. By 1803, Russian explorers and traders were actively probing the Pacific coastline, establishing settlements, making contact with indigenous populations from Alaska to California. Could the woman have been Russian? Perhaps the survivor of a shipwreck who had fashioned or found herself in an emergency life vessel? The Russians possessed advanced nautical technology for the era Tartui. Perhaps what Japanese fishermen interpreted as mysterious and otherworldly was simply unfamiliar European craftsmanship. This theory gains some traction when we consider the woman's physical description. Red hair appears in multiple accounts. Pale skin. Unusual height. These features align more closely with Northern European populations than East Asian ones. And the writing on the box she guarded so carefully, could that not have been Cyrillic script, completely alien to Japanese observers? But then the theory begins to fracture under scrutiny. Russian vessels of the period were wooden, built along traditional shipbuilding lines. Nothing in the Russian maritime record suggests they possessed the technology to create a small circular craft with crystal windows and smooth metal panels. The Russians were excellent seafarers, but they were not building vessels that would mystify experienced Japanese fishermen familiar with boats from across the known world. Moreover, Russian contact with Japan, while increasing, was documented. The arrival of a Russian national would likely have been noted, investigated, and recorded through proper diplomatic channels, particularly given the Tokugawa shogunate's strict policies regarding foreign contact. What about America then? By 1803, American merchant vessels were beginning to venture into Pacific waters with increasing frequency. American whalers and traders occasionally found themselves blown off course, deposited on unexpected shores by storms and currents. Could the mystery woman have been American? This explanation suffers from the same fundamental problems as the Russian theory. American vessels of the early 19th century were wooden-hulled ships, not radically different from European designs. Nothing in American maritime technology would explain the vessel's unusual construction. Furthermore, while Americans were beginning to explore the Pacific, they had limited presence in waters near Japan in 1803. The famous Commodore Perry expedition that would eventually open Japan to Western trade was still 50 years in the future. And here is the deeper problem with both Western origin theories. If the woman was Russian or American, why was she placed back in her vessel and sent away? The Japanese, despite their isolation policies, had protocols for dealing with foreign shipwreck survivors. They were generally treated humanely, provided with necessities, and eventually repatriated through Dutch trading contacts at Nagasaki. Why would this woman be different? Why the fear? Why the urgency to push her back out to sea? Perhaps we are looking in the wrong direction. Perhaps the answer lies not to the east or west, but closer to home. Korea and China both had maritime traditions, complex writing systems, and occasional reasons to exile individuals deemed problematic by authorities. Could the woman have been Korean or Chinese, set adrift in a punishment vessel? The exile theory has a certain appeal. In various cultures, throughout history, maritime exile has served as a form of capital punishment or political expediency. Cast someone out to sea and let the ocean serve as executioner, sparing the state direct responsibility for their death. The woman's apparent composure, her careful guarding of the box, her silence, these could all be interpreted as the dignity of someone accepting a terrible fate. Historical records from Korea and China include accounts of exile and punishment, but nothing that matches the Utsuro-bune description. Korean exile typically involved banishment to remote islands, not being set adrift in specially constructed vessels. Chinese maritime punishment was generally more direct, drowning or abandonment on uninhabited shores. Neither culture has surviving records of creating elaborate circular craft for the purpose of exile. It would be a tremendous expenditure of resources and craftsmanship to build such a vessel solely to dispose of one person, no matter their crime or political inconvenience. Moreover, if the woman was Korean or Chinese, why couldn't the Japanese identify her language? Japan had extensive contact with both civilizations. Japanese scholars studied Chinese extensively. Korean merchants and diplomats visited Japan. The samurai who examined the woman and her possessions were educated men, familiar with Chinese characters and likely aware of Korean writing. Yet the symbols in the woman's box matched nothing in their experience. The technological anachronism becomes impossible to ignore. We are now forced to confront what makes this case so frustrating: the vessel itself. What if we approach this from a different angle entirely? What if the craft was not a surface ship at all, but something else? What if it was a submarine? The submarine theory emerges from the vessel's described construction, watertight, with reinforced panels, possibly designed to operate both on and below the water's surface. By 1803, experimental submarine designs existed. The American inventor David Bushnell had built the Turtle during the Revolutionary War. Robert Fulton had demonstrated submarine prototypes to Napoleon. Could the Utsuro-bune have been an experimental submersible that malfunctioned or was abandoned? For a brief moment, this theory offers hope. It would explain the unusual construction, the waterproof nature, perhaps even the crystal windows designed to let in light underwater. It would categorize the event as remarkable, but ultimately explainable. An encounter with cutting-edge technology that simply seemed magical to those unfamiliar with submarine concepts. But the theory collapses almost immediately upon examination. Early submarine experiments were crude affairs, barely functional, requiring enormous support infrastructure. They were not capable of long-range travel. They certainly were not sophisticated enough to include clear viewing ports of the quality described. And most damning of all, why would an experimental submarine, representing an enormous investment in research and development, contain a single woman with a mysterious box. Where was the crew? Where was the military or scientific apparatus that would surround such a project? The submarine theory also fails to account for how such a craft could have traveled to Japan without any supporting vessels, without documented trials, without leaving any trace in historical records of European or American innovation. Submarines were years away from being practical vessels. The idea that a fully functional, beautifully crafted submersible could have been operating in the Pacific in 1803, completely unknown to history, strains credibility past the breaking point. So we return, again and again, to the central mystery. Every rational explanation illuminates certain details while casting others into deeper shadow. The woman was too foreign to be local, too inexplicable to be a simple shipwreck survivor, too technologically advanced in her vessel to fit any known maritime tradition of the era. The UFO hypothesis at least has the advantage of accounting for all the anomalies at once. An extraterrestrial origin would explain the unknown materials, the unidentified writing, the woman's strange appearance and inability to communicate, the advanced construction of the vessel. It would explain why the Japanese, despite their protocols for foreign contact, chose to push her back to sea. Perhaps some primitive instinct recognized that she was not just foreign but other, not from across the ocean, but from beyond it entirely. Yet accepting this explanation requires embracing a worldview that most of us resist. It requires believing that in 1803, an extraterrestrial craft malfunctioned or deliberately landed off the coast of Japan, that an alien being, humanoid in appearance, drifted ashore in an escape pod or life vessel, and that this encounter was witnessed, documented, and then buried in historical records where it waited for 20th century researchers to rediscover and reinterpret it. The genius of the Utsuro-bune mystery lies precisely in this space of irresolution. You came looking for answers, perhaps expecting that careful analysis and historical research would provide clarity. Instead, you find yourself more uncertain than when you started. Each explanation opens new questions. Each theory solves some problems while creating others. The rational mind, trained to find patterns and derive explanations, spins uselessly, unable to gain traction. Was she human or something else? Was the vessel a boat, a submarine, an escape pod, or something entirely outside our categories? Did she come from across the sea or from beyond the sky? The documents exist. The accounts agree on core details. Something happened on that beach in 1803. But what that something was remains as mysterious today as it was to the fishermen who first found her. Hollow ship rocking in the shallow water, strange woman inside, silent and unknowable, drifting between worlds. There are moments in history when ordinary people face choices that strip away all pretense of civilization, all comfort of moral clarity. The fishermen standing on that beach in 1803 faced such a moment. Before them, a woman, alive, breathing, terrified, and behind them, invisible but utterly present, the machinery of the Tokugawa shogunate ready to grind them and everyone they loved into dust. Let us be absolutely clear about what happened on that shore. These men found a human being in distress. She was not a myth anymore, not a story, not a curious object washed up by the tide. She was flesh and blood, her chest rising and falling with breath, her eyes moving, seeing them, perhaps pleading with them. Everything about the moment screamed for help, for rescue, for basic human compassion. And they chose to seal her back inside her floating coffin and push it into the ocean. This decision, this single act, is the darkest heart of the entire mystery. Forget the strange craft. Forget the unknown writing. Forget the speculation about where she came from or what the objects meant. The true horror is not in the unanswered questions about her origin. The true horror is in the answer we know with absolute certainty about her fate. These men condemned her to death, and they did it with full awareness of what they were doing. To understand this choice, to really grasp its weight, we must understand Sakoku. The word means closed country, but those two syllables carried the force of absolute law for over 200 years. In 1639, the Tokugawa shogunate sealed Japan's borders with a brutality that is hard to fathom in our modern world. No Japanese person could leave. No foreigner could enter. The punishment for violation was not imprisonment. It was not deportation. It was death. But the death penalty was not reserved for the violator alone. This is crucial to understanding the fisherman's choice. Under Sakaku law, entire communities could be executed for the crime of harboring a foreigner. If you helped someone from outside Japan, if you gave them food, if you offered them shelter, if you failed to immediately report them to authorities, the shogunate could legally execute you, your family, your neighbors, everyone in your village. Men, women, children died trial. No exceptions. No mercy. This was not theoretical. This was not an empty threat meant to discourage rule breaking. The Tokugawa government enforced these laws with meticulous cruelty. In 1640, after a failed Christian uprising, the shogunate crucified thousands. They burned entire villages suspected of harboring missionaries. They created a system where neighbors spied on neighbors, where any hint of foreign contact meant annihilation. The message was clear, and it was absolute. Contact with the outside world equals death. The fishermen knew this. Every Japanese person in the Edo period knew this. It was woven into the fabric of their existence, reinforced through generations. They had likely never seen a foreigner before, but they had heard the stories, absorbed the warnings, internalized the fear. The law was not distant or abstract. It was immediate and personal, enforced by local magistrates who would not hesitate to make examples of violators. So when they opened that vessel and found a living woman, they were not just discovering a mystery. They were discovering a death sentence floating in the water. Her very existence threatened everything. Their lives, their children's lives, the lives of everyone in their village. The choice before them was not between cruelty and kindness. The choice was between her life and the lives of everyone they love. Imagine standing in their position. You are a fisherman, probably illiterate, certainly not wealthy or powerful. You have a wife, children, aging parents depending on you. You live in a small coastal community where everyone knows everyone else. Your magistrate is not a distant figure, but someone who walks the same streets, who enforces the shogun's laws with personal attention. You have just found something that, if discovered, will result in your crucifixion. Not exile, not imprisonment. They will nail you to wooden beams and leave you to die slowly in the town square as a warning to others. Now look at the woman. She is strange beyond comprehension. Her skin might be pale in a way you have never seen. Her hair might be a color that exists nowhere in your experience. Her clothing is foreign, wrong, unsettling. She speaks sounds that are not language as you understand it. She might be crying, reaching out, clearly desperate. But she is also fundamentally alien, so far outside your frame of reference that your mind struggles to categorize her as fully human. In that era, in that isolated culture, the otherness might have been as frightening as the legal consequences. The fishermen made their choice. They took food from their own supplies and placed it in the vessel with her. This detail is important. They were not completely heartless. They were not sadistic. They were trying to square an impossible circle, attempting some minimal gesture of humanity while still protecting themselves. The food was perhaps meant to ease their guilt, to tell themselves they had done something, given her a chance. But they knew. They must have known. That food would run out in days. The water, if there was any, would not last. The ocean is vast and merciless. They sealed her back inside. Think about that action. Closing the lid, securing it, hearing whatever sounds she made as the light was shut away. Did she scream? Did she beat against the walls? Did she understand what was happening? The accounts do not tell us, but the fishermen heard it. They heard whatever she did in those final moments before the seal was complete. Then they pushed the vessel back into the water. How many of them did this take? Did they work in silence, or did they speak, justifying the choice to each other? Did anyone hesitate, hand on the strange craft, wondering if there was another way? The vessel floated. It caught the current or the wind, or simply drifted on the tide, and they watched it go. This is the image that should haunt us. The fishermen standing on the shore, watching the Utsuro-bune grow smaller and smaller as it moved away from land. They could see it for minutes, perhaps even an hour or more, depending on the conditions. A small shape on the vast expanse of water, carrying a living woman away from the only chance of survival she would ever have. They watched until it disappeared completely, swallowed by distance and the curvature of the earth. What did they feel in those minutes? Relief that the threat was gone? Guilt at what they had done? Fear that the magistrate might somehow find out anyway? Did they pray for her, asking whatever gods they believed in to forgive them, to perhaps guide the vessel to some other shore where different laws apply? Or did they simply feel the cold pragmatism of survival, the knowledge that they had chosen correctly according to the brutal mathematics of their world? We want our moral choices to be clear. We want to believe that when faced with someone in need, we would help, regardless of cost. But the fisherman's choice reveals an uncomfortable truth about human nature and about how power operates. The Tokugawa shogunate had created a system where compassion itself was a crime punishable by death. They had weaponized fear so effectively that ordinary people would commit an act of horror to protect themselves and their families. And it was an act of horror. Make no mistake, the woman in that vessel almost certainly died. If she was shipwrecked, as seems likely, then the vessel was not seaworthy for long journeys. It might have been damaged. It definitely was not provisioned for extended survival. The chances of it drifting to another shore before she died of thirst or starvation were virtually zero. The chances of it being found by another vessel in the vast Pacific were even smaller. The fishermen knew this. When they pushed that craft back into the ocean, they were pushing her toward death, as surely as if they had killed her with their own hands. Perhaps the guilt explains why the story was recorded at all. Someone told this tale to the chroniclers, provided the details, described the woman and the vessel with such specificity that artists could create detailed illustrations. Why? If the smart choice was to forget, to never speak of it, to let the incident vanish as thoroughly as the vessel itself, why did this story survive? Perhaps because the weight of what they had done was too heavy to carry in silence. Perhaps recording it was a form of confession, a way to distribute the guilt beyond themselves. The story spread through texts like Ton Shosetsu and Yume no Kiri, each retelling adding details or changing elements, but the core remained. A woman in a strange vessel, found alive, sent back to die. The variations in the accounts might reflect different witnesses, or they might reflect the way guilt distorts memory, each person remembering the details slightly differently, emphasizing different aspects to make the choice seem more justified or less terrible. Modern readers often focus on the mystery of where she came from, spinning elaborate theories about Russian explorers or Pacific islanders, or even more fantastical origins. But this focus on the unexplained allows us to avoid the truly disturbing question. Not where did she come from, but why did she have to die? The answer is uncomfortable because it reveals how easily ordinary people can commit extraordinary cruelty when systems of power make that cruelty seem necessary. The fishermen were not monsters. This is important to understand. They were not evil men who enjoyed causing suffering. They were people trapped in an impossible situation created by a totalitarian system that left no room for mercy. The true evil was not in their choice, but in the system that made such a choice necessary. The Tokugawa shogunate, in its obsession with control and isolation, had created conditions where finding a living person in distress became an existential threat rather than an opportunity for compassion. Yet knowing this does not erase what happened. The woman, whoever she was, whatever her story, deserved better. She deserved rescue, care, help. Instead, she got a handful of food and a death sentence in the form of an outgoing tide. The fisherman's fear was real and justified, but it does not change the fact that they watched a human being drift toward death and did nothing to stop it. The Utsuro-bune disappeared into the ocean, and with it, a life ended in terror and loneliness. The fishermen returned to their village, to their families, to their lives. They had survived. They had made the choice that their world demanded. But somewhere in the vast Pacific, a vessel floated with its silent cargo, a testament to the moment when survival and humanity stood in opposition, and survival won. This is the moral climax of the mystery, the point where folklore becomes tragedy. Whatever else the Utsuro-bune represents, it represents this truth about human nature and power. When the cost of compassion is death, how many of us would choose differently than those fishermen? The question hangs in the air, unanswered and unanswerable, as dark and deep as the ocean that swallowed the hollow ship and the woman within it. There are questions that history refuses to answer. Mysteries that time does not solve, but only deepens. The woman in the hollow ship, encountered off the coast of Japan in 1803, remains one of those eternal enigmas that haunts us not despite the lack of answers, but because of it. We have looked at the evidence, examined the accounts, explored every theory and possibility. Yet when all the speculation falls away, we are left with something more unsettling than any solution could provide. We are left with silence. Who was she really? We have called her a princess, a criminal, an exile, a widow. We have imagined her as victim and as willing passenger. We have dressed her in the robes of nobility and the chains of punishment. But these are our stories, not hers. The fisherman who found her never learned her name, never understood her language, never discovered what circumstances had placed her in that drifting coffin. She exists in history as a blank space where a person should be, a human-shaped absence that we fill with our own fears and fascinations. Perhaps she was none of the things we have imagined. Perhaps she was something we lack the context to even comprehend. What was in that box? The fisherman described it as precious, something she guarded with desperation. They said she would not allow anyone to approach it, that she clutched it through every moment of those strange hours on the beach. Human heads, said some accounts. Sacred relics, said others. The remains of a lover, a husband, a child. Documents that could prove her identity or condemn her further. Treasure or testimony. But no one ever saw inside. The box returned to the ocean with her, its contents as unknowable now as they were then. We do not even know what shape the mystery takes. We cannot measure the dimensions of what we are missing. Did she survive? This might be the most haunting question of all. The fishermen, after their consultation with village elders, after their deliberation about laws and logistics and the complications of foreign contact, placed her back in the hollow ship and pushed it back into the Pacific. They watched her drift away. Some accounts say they waited until she disappeared beyond the horizon. Others suggest they turned away, unable to watch what came next. But none tell us what became of her. Did the currents carry her to another shore, somewhere she could speak and be understood? Did she drift for days, weeks, slowly dying of thirst and starvation in that wooden prison? Or did the sea open up and swallow her within hours, the hollow ship taking on water through some crack or seam, sinking with its silent passengers still inside? We sent her to an unknown fate, and then forgot to wonder about it until it was far too late to care. Where did the vessel come from? Naval experts and maritime historians have examined the descriptions and found no clear answer. The construction techniques do not clearly match any known tradition. Too refined for a primitive craft, too unusual for standard shipbuilding. Some elements suggest Japanese design, others point elsewhere. The metal fittings, the glass windows, the elaborate joining of the wood, all speak to sophisticated knowledge and careful craftsmanship. Someone built this vessel with specific purpose and considerable skill, but no records exist of its construction. No shipyard claims its origin. No design documents survive in any archive anywhere. It appeared out of nowhere, as if the ocean itself had dreamed it into being. Why has no matching account been found in any other nation's records from 1803? This might be the most telling absence of all. If the woman was Russian, why do Russian records contain no mention of her? If Korean, where are the Korean documents describing her disappearance? If from some other Pacific nation, why have their oral histories not preserved her story? The Japanese accounts exist in multiple sources, recorded by different hands, documented in official reports. But the other half of this story, the half that explains where she came from and why, simply does not exist anywhere. It is as if she manifested from nothing, fully formed and already doomed, her past erased before she ever touched Japanese waters. We lack the one thing that could solve this mystery completely. Her voice, her story, her truth. Everything we know comes filtered through observers who could not understand her, documented by people who never spoke with her directly. We have the fisherman's confusion, the elders' deliberations, the officials' careful reports about what to do with an unexpected problem. But we do not have her words. We do not know what she was trying to communicate when she spoke in that unknown language. We do not know what she would have said if someone could have understood her. Did she beg them to let her continue drifting? Did she plead for help? Did she try to explain the box, the ship, her circumstances? Or did she say nothing of substance, knowing that language had become useless, that she was beyond the reach of human aid? There is a particular tragedy in this silence. The woman had a story. She had memories and knowledge and explanations. She knew exactly who she was, where she came from, why she was there. The mystery that torments us did not exist for her. She carried all the answers, locked inside a mind that could not transmit them across the barrier of language and culture. Somewhere in her final hours, whether they came quickly or stretched across terrible days, all that knowledge died with her. The solution to one of history's most persistent mysteries disappeared beneath the Pacific waves, irretrievable forever. Somewhere in those waters, perhaps the hollow ship remains. This is not impossible. The ocean is deep and vast, and objects can rest undisturbed for centuries in the right conditions. Maybe the vessel sank in some trench where the pressure and cold preserve, rather than destroy. Maybe it rests on the bottom, still sealed, still containing what it always contained. A wooden sphere with glass windows, housing silence. Or maybe it is still drifting, caught in some eternal current that carries it in endless circles through the Pacific. A ghost ship in the truest sense, hollow in more ways than one, carrying its permanent absence across the face of the water. Modern fishermen still work those same waters off the Japanese coast. They use different boats now, follow different techniques, but they cover the same territory that their ancestors worked in 1803. Sometimes, surely, they must pass over the spot where the hollow ship was found, where the woman drifted with her mysterious cargo. Do they think about her? Do they know the story? And if one day, a strange vessel appeared in their nets or alongside their boat, if they encountered something that should not be there, something from a time or place they could not identify, what would they do? What would any of us do? This is the final question the mystery poses. Not what happened to her, but what we would do if it happened again. If confronted with a human being in desperate circumstances, but circumstances we do not fully understand. Someone who cannot explain themselves, cannot make their case, cannot fit into our categories and procedures. Do we help, even when help might mean complicating our own lives, breaking protocols, accepting responsibility for outcomes we cannot predict? Or do we do what seems reasonable at the time, what seems to balance compassion with practicality? Do we push the problem back into the ocean and hope it resolves itself somewhere beyond our sight? The hollow ship mystery persists because it is about more than one woman in one vessel in 1 year. It persists because it asks questions about how we respond to the unknown, the foreign, the inexplicable. It holds up a mirror to our limitations and asks us to consider what we lose when we turn away from what we cannot immediately understand. The woman in the hollow ship remains unknown, not because the truth is impossible to find, but because no one prioritized finding it when it mattered, when she was there with all the answers locked inside her. And so the mystery drifts on, as eternal as the ocean that created it, as hollow as the vessel that contained it. Somewhere between history and legend, between fact and story, between what happened and what we wish we knew, she remained. Not a person anymore, but a question. Not a victim or a princess or an exile, but a reminder. A reminder that some silences cannot be filled, some absences cannot be replaced, and some questions remain forever unanswered because we failed to ask them while the answers were still possible. The Pacific keeps its secrets, and this one, it will keep forever. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.